I guess the first part of that is my sport. My sport is all sport. In the job that I do, uh, I'm not just interested in the big sports in football. I'm also interested in um, other global sports, tennis, golf, motorsport, Formula One in particular, but also domestically and what happens at the amateur and grassroots level. Um, for me, obviously, there seems to be a short to medium term imperative, which is essentially about, and I'm not sure which comes at number one and which comes at number two. So I'll leave them for people to decide which is one and which is two. Is to finish the season, to finish competitions, to finish tournaments, which is obviously in operational terms a major priority, particularly if there is a possibility that we can start next season on time, whatever next season might be in whichever sport. There's obviously short to medium term a cash flow imperative as well. As we know, there are lots of teams, lots of sports that are especially vulnerable right now because they are dependent upon gate receipts. And we can think about sports where gate receipts constitute more than 50% of their turnover. So these are difficult times. So for anybody with an interest in the long-term health and well-being of sport, I think those two things, obviously, for operational and financial reasons are really important. However, I think for me personally, there is a longer-term issue. I'm a great watcher of policy and strategy. This is something that I find interesting, intriguing, and in some ways is much neglected and much derided in certain circles. And what I mean by policy and strategy is, in very simple terms, once the virus is over, what happens next? And really, we have to start thinking about that now, because if we are faced with, for instance, some clubs going out of business, if we are faced with the prospect of the stronger organizations in sport dominating once all of this is over, if we are thinking about properties within sport feeling inclined to take money from, for example, Chinese investors at this point, there are long-term consequences of these things. And so we need to, as a country, and I think all countries across the world need to do this as well. And I think the international community, the international sporting community, needs to think about these things too. Is what do we want the future of our sport to look like? And so this requires some policy and strategy thinking now rather than later, because as the effects of the virus begin to seriously impact and the post-virus landscape begins to emerge, what we have to ensure as a global sport community is we have the kind of sport post-corona that we actually want to have. I am talking about commercially. I am talking about jobs and communities and the kind of the economic prosperity of communities. But I think also we need to get a grip on what role we feel sport will play in the health and well-being of people post-corona. What role sport will play in terms of people rebuilding their personal and their community identities post-corona. There are going to be issues around social cohesion. There are going to be political issues, because I think we will see certain stakeholders, we'll see certain countries seeking to take advantage of their positions within the global sporting industry to either re-establish their power or to establish new bases of power. So there are some really quite deep and fundamental questions that already we're facing. And I do understand we need to finish leagues and competitions, and I do understand small sports clubs need to survive. But I also think the global sport community needs to decide what happens next. We're reading more and more people in the media, people on social media, referring to this being a reset moment for sport, But even assuming that we have met the reset moment, reset to what? To 2010, 2000, 1992, 1956. What exactly are we resetting to? We've also then got the question, on what basis are we resetting, and who's going to do the resetting? And so, I think some in the community already have a sense that something has to change, but we are going to have to confront the reality of exactly what is it that needs to change, and how are we going to change it, and how are we going to make sure that what is now a much bigger and more diverse sector. And notice I don't use the word industry, because industry implies one thing, and I think sport is much more than just one thing. But certainly in this sector, we're going to have to start making what I think will be some very profound decisions. And I hope ultimately sport comes out of this in a stronger, healthier place, as I do the world in general. But as we know, the coronavirus is really testing that to its absolute limits. And I think it will test it to its limits in sport as well. My first reaction to that question was not a lot. And the reason for saying that, and excuse my flippancy, I will balance it later by giving another answer. The reason for saying that is because I think somebody who for the last decade has essentially been in the middle of his career, I've had to face decisions about what I'm going to do next, and reflect upon where I've come from, what I like doing, what I'm good at, what I'm not so good at, what I could improve, what I want to stay away from completely. And so one of the things that I have done, and I was calculating that going back to 2011, 2012, I started to meditate. And so this kind of mindfulness and meditation boom that has taken place over the last 10 years. I actually had my surfing shorts and my surfboard out pretty early. So I was ready to catch the wave before it had even arrived. And so I kind of distanced myself from the from the fashionable ones who they didn't get into this until 2017, 2018. I was hardcore. I was there first. But what I would say is I think meditation and mindfulness have dramatically and fundamentally changed me as a person. And I think that meditation and mindfulness have dramatically and fundamentally changed how I work. And what I do is I think I am more thoughtful and insightful, but at the same time, I hope I'm more decisive and confident in the decisions that I make. I'm less concerned, or should I say, I'm less afraid by failure. And I'm a strong believer in aiming high and being positive. There's something too in this, in terms of just knowing who you are, and knowing both your limitations, but also knowing the contribution, and being comfortable with the contribution that you make. And so rather than saying, well, I learned this because of the current crisis, what I would prefer to say is things that I've learned over the last decade, I think I'm now being able to apply during challenging times, and I'm much better equipped than I think I might have been 10, 15 years ago. And I feel much less fazed by some of the things that I'm having to deal with now. And what I would say to anybody who has never tried meditation or practiced mindfulness is give it a go. If it doesn't work for you, if it doesn't work for you, it doesn't work for you. But I think for most people, you will find that if you commit to it and you persevere, there are tangible benefits for you, not just as an individual, domestically, personally, but also as a professional, as a manager, as a leader, as somebody who is keen to make a positive contribution to the field in which you work. I think in terms of what I have learned is there are several things. I always try to be socially oriented in the way that I go about my job. I'm an educationalist, after all. You know, I think one of the core purposes of being an educationalist is to serve some kind of social role. But I think the crisis has reminded me of that, but has brought to mind this term that sometimes I read, which is pro-social behavior. And you know, I obviously I've got an ego. Obviously, I've got personal motives. Obviously, I do things because they're important to me. I'm just a human being. But I think what the virus has reminded me is that whenever I do something, no matter what it is, I should factor in a pro-social behavior. So, in other words, you know, don't do everything for yourself. You know, don't do things just for yourself. You've got to think about, you know, who else is going to benefit from the things that I do. So that's one thing I would say to all leaders, managers, and to people in general. You know, in your day-to-day life, try to think about one pro-social behavior that you can develop, that you can improve, that you can make a big, stronger contribution to. And in sporting terms, that led me into thinking about Team Sky, or Team Ineos as they are now, and marginal gains, and this whole notion of marginal gains. And I think that kind of that sporting employment of the marginal gains philosophy is something that we should all be thinking about now. And even when it comes down to protection, you know, if each of us can just make one small improvement in the way that we are responding to the virus, that stock of small improvements leads to one big improvement. And yet, if we can make if each of us can make lots and lots and lots of small improvements, or we can protect ourselves in lots and lots of small ways, that adds up to, you know, a big change. And so again, I think this is one of the things that has dawned on me is that you know, we've got to be pro-social, no matter how big or small those pro-social behaviors are. You know, the marginal gains of that accumulation of small positive changes, whatever they are, will make a positive contribution in total to not only to the situation we're in now, but hopefully to what happens to us all after we get out of this. The only other thing I would say is I was bowled over, really bowled over, and I tweeted this. So for any keen observers or keen Twitter users, it's on my timeline. When I think his name is Andrew Ryan from the World Health Organization, an Irish guy, he spoke a week or two ago about how to deal with emergencies, and he talked about perfection being the enemy of action, which I thought was a really interesting thing. And he specifically said, we're all so scared nowadays to make mistakes that we labor over decisions. And because we labor over these decisions, we tend often not to do anything. And when you're faced with an emergency, this can't be. We have to have a different culture, a different philosophy. But my view would be is we need to carry that forwards, because I think during recent times we have lived looking over our shoulders. You know, somebody's going to tell us that we've done it the wrong way. Somebody's going to criticize us for doing it. Somebody's going to tell us about the mistakes that we've made. And we need to get through that period of history. We need a new period of history in which people step up, they show initiative, they take responsibility, they demonstrate leadership, they show creativity and innovation. And I hope, for me personally, again, I can carry that forwards into the future. And I stopped looking over my shoulder quite so much as perhaps I might have done over the last 10 years. And I try to engage in pro-social behaviors that help people, help society, take us forwards. You know, don't be afraid of making mistakes. Just try to make the world, try to make life a better place and a better thing, you know, a better life to lead. One of the other things I think that comes from in my case, I think came from meditation, is we have to learn to trust ourselves individually and as a society. If you take, let's say you take an average 45-year-old, or an average 40-year-old, or an average 35-year-old, who is perhaps contemplating or is concerned about their place in the world, and who are they and what are they good at. And the reality is, if you're an average 45-year-old, you've got yourself this far. You've actually managed to get yourself through 45 years of all kinds of different things. And I think it's important, therefore, to trust yourself. You trust yourself to know to do the right thing. You trust yourself to make good decisions. You trust yourself to be able to make a contribution. And I would hope that during the current crisis, I think people like us, we do have the skills, we do have the knowledge, we do have the ability, we do have the resilience, but we have to trust ourselves. And just as we're trusting health workers to do their jobs, I think we also have to trust ourselves to be able to do the right thing as well. Trust ourselves that by not going out into the street, we're doing the right thing. Trust ourselves that when we are working from home, we are working just as efficiently. Trust ourselves that when we start a charitable collection for somebody somewhere, trust that we are doing the right thing. So again, I think we talk about trust a lot, but very often we tend to conceive of trust in terms of other people. We trust these people or we don't trust these people. But what we need to do, and I would call for people to do this during this particular time, is do you trust yourself? And I would say in most cases, most of us we deserve to, and we're perfectly entitled to trust ourselves to do the right thing as well. For me, a core concept or principle that I've employed more and more when I speak to students and also myself is give people reasons to hire you. And what I do is I bound this up in this notion of personal brand. And when I'm running classes, typically what I'll do is I'll get the students to tell me about their mobile phones. So who's got an iPhone? And people will put up their hands. I've got an iPhone. Okay, so why have you got an iPhone? Well, it's kind of cool and it's trendy, and everything is in one place, and I like the usability of it, and it's expensive, but I know what I'm getting for my money, and they will tell you. Then I'll say to the people who've got Huawei's, why have you got a Huawei? And normally they'll say because it's a really, really great price and because the camera is fantastic. And the amazing thing about this is I've done this in lots of different settings. I've done it with older students, younger students. I've done it in Britain, in Spain, in Germany, in France, and you get exactly the same answers from these groups of people time after time after time after time. So successful brands, great brands, iconic brands are very, very good at giving people reasons to buy their products. And so in those terms, for me, students who are transitioning to the workplace, or for people already in the workplace who are looking to move on to their next position, my view would be is that they should try and conceive of themselves as brands. Now, as we know, brands can be interpreted in lots of different ways. Yes, they are a logo. And I guess for us as individuals, the logo is our picture, our image. And when people see your photograph, they think, yeah, this is the sport governance guy. Yeah, this is the woman who's really great in sport finance. But obviously, cognitively, your photograph, your image, is a trigger to lead others to start forming attitudes and opinions about you, and then to engage in behaviors in connection with you. So it's really, really important, I think, for personal branders to know who they are, what they like, what contribution they can make, what products they are offering, what their competitive advantage is, and how this plays through in terms of the ways in which they present themselves. So, a very common one is graduates, university graduates are always very good at saying things like, "I work hard" at interview. Okay, at interview, I don't think I've ever met a person who says, "I don't work hard at all." It's obvious that people are going to go to interview and say, "I work hard." So that, that's not really part of your brand. I think what's really part of your brand is, well, okay, if you work hard, in what ways do you work hard? In what ways is that hard work effective? How are you measuring that hardness? In what ways is your hard work different to and better than others? And so all of these kinds of, I guess you could call them self-questioning exercises, are an important constituent part of what your personal brand is, how you position it, how you accentuate it. And there are then, I think, kind of really interesting practical measures around which you can base your brand. Very often I'll ask students, for example, does anyone keep a vlog of sport business and management? Does anybody run a podcast series about sport business and management? Does anyone keep a blog, where you write your thoughts, you write analyses of the sector? And typically most students say no. At which point I throw my arms up and say, "Oh my goodness, why don't you do this?" Because obviously if one person in this room of 50 people was doing that, already you're beginning to manage and shape your brand, and you're creating some kind of differential advantage from others. So I think what people need to do is to think about, what is it that I'm doing that nobody else is doing? It's a unique contribution, it's adding value, and it's positioning me in the marketplace to be in a much more competitive position than I might otherwise have been. So I think, in simple terms, personal branding. And I think it's, it is like, for example, a car. I'm going to go buy a car. I'm going to go get a job. I'm going to buy a car. Obviously, buying a car is much more complex than just going and buying a car, because you've got to decide which model, and you've got to decide how much money you've got, and you've got to decide, what kind of features and functions you want, and you've got to decide, do you like Italian cars or do you like German cars? And essentially, that's what recruiters are doing. They're going out and buying a car. They've got, when they're buying this car, they're hiring labor, and they're going to be looking for a whole bunch of different qualities. And I think within this, there is this sense of alignment too, because one of the things that I very often say to students is that, okay, I know you need a job, I know you need money, I know you're trying to get a foot on the ladder, but there is this alignment too, and they've got to think about, do you align with them? But equally, you've also got to think about, do you align with the business? Do you align with the organization that you're trying to work with? And so it's a much more, rather than an us and them scenario, which I think very often this kind of recruitment process is, it's better to see it almost like a form of strategic collaboration. And of course, you don't strategically collaborate with people or with organizations where there isn't this alignment, there isn't this match. And so, whilst I genuinely do appreciate, I've got I know how this works. I do know that people need jobs because they need money, because they need a house and food and all these other things. I do know that. But in terms of building a career, I think the mentality amongst graduates who are looking for work needs to shift, and to see the process in a different way. I think about this. This instance very, very often, and I have a particular view. Is if you think about things often, it means that there's something of importance in them for you. And in this particular case, I think it has always had something of importance for me, and it continues to have something of importance for me. And it goes back 24 years. It goes back a long time. When I was younger, I had a full head of hair. I was not quite as good looking as I am now, but I was new to universities. I was an aspiring researcher. I wanted to make my mark. I kind of had it in my mind that I could cut it with the big boys and girls, and so I was invited to another university, a fairly prestigious university, to give a seminar on the Premier League. And keeping in mind, at the time, the Premier League was only 3 or 4 years old, so it was a very different thing to what it is now. And I turned up, and there was a room full of academics from this prestigious university sat there waiting for this fresh-faced young guy to come along and talk about the Premier League. And I was as keen as mustard. And I got my 968 slides for the 20-minute presentation, which is, of course, when you're first starting out, it's better to have more slides than fewer slides. Even though I had probably only got through 3 of the 900 and whatever it is slides that I had prepared. And most people were asleep. Some people were really engaged and enthused. But of course, as in every audience, as in every room, when you're giving a presentation, there's one person who they're just going to pursue you because they want to pursue you. And I'm not going to swear at that point. I'll just leave it to people who are watching to use their own words. They can insert their word here. And so I came out of this presentation after about 45, 50 minutes, just utterly deflated. I was just destroyed might be too strong a word, but I just thought, what is the point? What is the point? And the professor who had invited me to do this presentation, who is still out there, actually a guy called Grant Jarvie, Professor Grant Jarvie. He works works in Edinburgh at Edinburgh University. And Grant, older than me, put his arm around my shoulder and he said, "Simon, so long as you're doing something positive, you're making a contribution." And I thought, okay. Now, I've never said this to Grant Jarvie, and I'm trying to think, probably the last time I saw Grant Jarvie was 2010, maybe. So it's a good decade since I've even seen the guy. So I've never told Grant Jarvie this, but Grant Jarvie may well be interested to know that something he said to me in 1996 has really stuck in the back of my mind. And it is, so long as you're doing something positive, you're making a contribution. And so what I would say to anybody out there, anybody who's trying to play a role during these difficult times, anybody who doesn't know, what the next step is going to be for their career, people who out there who may be afraid of taking a decision, I think the important thing is so long as you're trying to do something positive, no matter how small, is you're making a contribution. And I think you're making a contribution to the organization you're working for. You're making a contribution to society. You're making a contribution to your own career and to your own well-being. So yeah, that's what I would say. Grant Jarvie, 1996. In my mind, in the Rolodex at the back of my brain, so long as you're doing something, no matter how small, so long as you're doing something positive, no matter how small, you're making a contribution.